David Hume is certainly the most important philosopher who has ever written in the English language. Russell also thinks that David Hume, in some sense, is the most important philosopher of all times. And we shall talk about Immanuel Kant next time. And Immanuel Kant, to a large extent, has been prompted to create his philosophy as a response to Hume's skepticism. Russell does not think that Kant actually has a good response. So I said a second ago that Hume and Kant are supposed to be two of the most important philosophers. Well, Russell certainly has a preference for Hume of those two, and he actually says at some point, when you will have read the chapter, you will notice this phrase. He says that basically Kant and Hegel represent a pre-Humean type of metaphysics. So they are, in some sense, like older, more ancient philosophers than Hume. People who neither understand Hume nor can really answer Hume's challenge. And although I'm not supposed to give you my opinion, and I won't, I think there's some merit to what Russell is saying. I think what Russell is saying has to be taken seriously. Again, it's a common conception that Kant is supposed to be the most important philosopher of all time, but to what extent has he actually provided an answer to Hume? That's a big question. We shall talk about this next time and in the seminar. Okay, so before I jump into Hume, let me talk in general. Let me situate Hume in his context, and specifically let me say a couple of sentences about Locke and Berkeley, so that we understand where Hume is coming from. So, in the second semester, we're going to deal with two broad topics. The first one is epistemology. What is epistemology?
Theory of knowledge.
The theory of knowledge. Epistemology answers the question of how do I know the things that I supposedly know. And this is the first conceptual block. And the second conceptual block is political philosophy. So we deal with theory of knowledge and political philosophy. We'll start on political philosophy in a bit, in a couple classes. So right now we are in the middle of epistemology. So basically the new theory of knowledge emerges with Descartes. And the name of Descartes is associated with something that's usually referred to as the epistemological turn. Epistemological turn. Epistemological turn. The phrase which basically means revolution in epistemology. Again, epistemology, episteme, the Greek word episteme means knowledge, so epistemological turn. Revolution in the theory of knowledge. Revolution in the way we approach the question of knowledge. Something like that. Now, hopefully, you more or less understand what epistemological turn is about. We had a class on Descartes before. But the general idea is that once the new science gets going, it becomes clear that certain propositions that were held by the ancients to be absolutely certain about the nature of the universe, about the nature of the cosmos, about how physics is supposed to work, suddenly people realized that these propositions were wrong, demonstrably wrong. And so all of a sudden, there arises the question of how can we re-establish the foundation for knowledge on a new basis. And this, after the epistemological turn, is going to be a very subjectivistic foundation. So, truth is something that you have to decide for yourself what is true. And Descartes gives us a model of how to do this through the method of doubt. You take everything that is uncertain and you say that's not knowledge. The only thing that's really knowledge is something that I can know with absolute certainty. Now in Descartes, you take away the cheating move of introducing God. It's actually not very much. So there's, from the very beginning, there is this skeptical element associated with the epistemological turn. But this is basically how where the ground lies. Now, also another way to phrase epistemological turn is that, again, in this subjectivism, in this Descartes thinking in his own head, what can I know? This cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. That epistemological turn is characterized by turning away from talking about objects in the real world. What are the objects of the real world? Can we know about the objects of the real world? According to Descartes, we can only be certain about what we perceive. So epistemological turn is a turn from the objects in the real world to the ideas in the mind. Objects in the real world to the ideas in the mind. The word idea here used broadly. So ideas would include perceptions and pains and itches and whatever. So the way to try to establish the certainty of knowledge after the epistemological turn comes in two basic flavors. And these two basic flavors are the Continental Rationalism and the British empiricism. So let's draw this on the board. So we have the British empiricists and the Continental Rationalists. So obviously, these guys come from Britain. These guys live on the continent, the European continent. And the names which are important here, the proper way to start is, strictly speaking, Bacon and Hobbes, but we're not talking about them. Hobbes being actually philosophically more important than Bacon. And then we talk about Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. On this side, do I have a better marker, I wonder? So, why is it so bad? Whatever. Okay, so on this side, we start with Descartes, who starts the whole thing, right? And then we proceed through Spinoza, Leibniz, to Immanuel Kant. Now Kant, and we'll talk about this more next time, supposedly abolishes this distinction, like he resolves the dispute. But strictly speaking, and I'm accountable for this, right? And you are accountable for this. We need to explain why, even though Kant tries to solve this dilemma, like unite the two schools, actually, at the end of the day, according to the empiricists, he would be considered a rationalist. Short one-line answer is because he believes in innate ideas. Basically, the difference between the two approaches is, do you believe that there's something apart from experience which tells you the truth? If you say no, experience is the only judge, then you're on this side. If you say no, there's something in addition to experience, you're on this side. Rationalism. So again, the word empiricism basically comes from the Latin word for experience. Experience, right? So all knowledge comes from experience on this side. And these guys are rationalists because they think that there's a rational, reasonable faculty in the mind in addition to experience. So, and usually this takes the shape of talking about innate ideas. Innate ideas. So innate ideas are ideas which you have in your head before you were born. In some sense, the things that you can know for sure before you were born. Innate ideas for these guys would be exemplified by what kind of knowledge? Can you guess? What are the sorts of things that you can know before you are born? For sure. Yeah, mathematics, geometry, logic. Yeah. So, let's introduce some more technical jargon. There's two kinds of propositions. One, again, so Kant will introduce technical jargon. He will call one kind of proposition synthetic, other kind of proposition analytical. I will write these words on the board. Before I write technical terms, let's use colloquial language. So people like Leibniz or Locke or Hume will say that there are two kinds of statements or two kinds of truths. Let's say two kinds of statements, all true statements about the world, all meaningful statements about the world, all meaningful sentences about the world, divided into two kinds. The sentences that deal with relations between ideas and statements that deal in matters of fact. So relations of ideas and matters of fact. So on this side of the board, the relations of ideas are more important than matters of fact. For on this side of the board, matters of fact are more important than relations of ideas. To be more precise, for the British empiricists, you know about the relations of ideas judging from the matters of fact. So matters of fact, again, this has to do with experience. Something that is derived from experience. So, again, let's take a very simple. So again, the paradigmatic example of relations of ideas is logic, mathematics, and maybe geometry. So, relations of ideas are sentences which are true by virtue of the terms used in the sentence. So, the classical example is all bachelors are unmarried. Or another example, all triangles have 3 sides. Kant's example, all bodies have extension. That's more complicated. All triangles have 3 sides. You can know that all triangles have 3 sides, especially for these guys, as a necessary truth about the world, independent of experience. Triangles must have 3 sides. This is part of the definition. In some sense, it is a tautology. Do you know the word tautology? Тавтология. So, basically, again, the difference between 2 sides of the board. Again, this is a distinction, an important distinction. These people disagree. There's a Chinese wall between them, if you want. So these guys, Locke and Hume, are going to say, we only derive knowledge from experience, and then from experience we infer things such as mathematics. So how do I know that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, according to Hume and Locke? This is how I know. I take 2 objects, I take 2 objects, and I count. And maybe I take objects in the external world, or maybe I just close my eyes and imagine objects in my head. But still, it is a matter of perception. It is a matter of experience. So, experience, perception, empirical, matters of fact. Fact. All of this side of the board. And for these guys, for Locke and Hume, we have to talk about Hume today. Relations of ideas are parasitic, are derivative from matters of fact. And if you think that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, and then you go and count in the real world and the numbers don't add up, then you have made a mistake. Experience can correct relations of ideas. Okay. So, on this side of the board, the reverse is kind of true. Now, these guys do not want to throw experience out the window completely. But they want to say that experience by itself does not really give you knowledge. This is the beeswax experiment of beeswax thought experiment of Descartes. Experience by itself does not give you knowledge. Experience has to be filtered through and guided by reason. Now, the extreme, and Kant is going to say that as well, that experience by itself is blind. It doesn't really tell you anything. You need certain ideas or categories of perception, as Kant calls them, that you have in a sense since the time before you were born. And only those rational structures of the mind help you make sense of experience. Now, the extreme view, and let me signal this is only true for Leibniz and maybe true for Spinoza. But this is not true for everybody on the side of the board. So Leibniz will say that actually the only true statements about the world, are the statements that have to deal with relations between ideas. Let me, again, helping us for next time, let me introduce 2 additional pieces of jargon, which are, so these statements, the relations of ideas, are supposed to be analytic statements, and these are supposed to be synthetic statements. Now, Again, analytic means that you can know whether the statement is true or false just by analyzing the terms in the sentence. So again, triangle has 3 sides. I analyze the words in the sentence and I say, yes, this is true, because triangles by definition have 3 sides. If I say triangles have 4 sides, this is analytically false. I can analyze the term in the statement and say, no, it's false. Synthetic terms are not like this. So for example, again I said, triangles have 3 sides. This is one thing. Or Alexander has 3 markers. Okay, triangles have 3 sides. I can just analyze the term in the sentence and know it's true or false. Alexander has 3 markers. Right now it's true. Now it's not true. I cannot know the truth of the statement outside of experience, right? So the statement, Alexander has 3 markers, or all university professors have 3 markers. This is true or false depending on the experience. So you, in some sense, you cannot analyze the truth or the falsehood of the statement from the statement itself. You have to, if you want, synthesize the truth or the falsehood of the statement from the world. You have to take something from the world and synthesize from it the truth or the falsehood of the statement. Like you synthesize the gist of truth from the world and you compare it to what's contained in the statement. You have to take 2 elements and see whether it's true or false. Whereas these you don't have to do. These you can know just by looking at the statement, at the sentence itself. Okay, so for Leibniz, I remind you, if you've read your Russell carefully, Leibniz says that all truths are actually analytic truths. That since the world is created by God to be the best of all possible worlds, this is the logically single possible world that God could have created, because this is the best of all possible worlds. So actually the fact that there are, let's say, that I have 3 markers in my hands, this is as necessary as the fact that triangle has 3 sides for Leibniz. It's just that our mind is small, and we just cannot imagine all of the terms of the equation that go into it. And Leibniz says that there are finitely analytical statements, like triangles have 3 sides, and we can know that they're true or false. And there are infinite analytical statements, which is basically his term for synthetic statements. Did you understand that? Let's go over this once again. So for Hume and Locke, mathematics is true because of experience. For Leibniz, experience is true because of mathematics. Because again, this world has to be logically or mathematically the best of all possible worlds that God could have created. And God necessarily creates the best of all possible worlds. Something like, now this is a position of Leibniz, and to some extent Spinoza, Kant and Descartes will not really go that far. But I want you to see the difference. Where does real knowledge come from? Now, we have 2 positions. One says that basically the only thing I can know for sure is what I see with my own eyes, for Hume. For these guys, the only thing I can know for sure is, let's say, 2 + 2 = 4, something that I can see with my own mind. Who is true? Or are both of them true? What happens if what my mind tells you conflicts with my experience? These are complicated questions, which do not really have an answer. This is a debate that rages on up until today. And if you are brave enough or crazy enough to take my course in philosophy of science next year, we will discuss this debate next year, because it still goes on until this day. This is not resolved. And there are problems on both sides. Basically, if you say that only math is true, how can you prove that? And if you say that, let's say, only the experience is true, what can you derive from that? Both sides have huge problems. Can we prove that 2 + 2 = 4? Can we prove it? Can you have a proof? Okay, this is something you're not responsible for on the exam. Bertrand Russell, the author of your textbook, by the way, one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell himself, and a brilliant logician and mathematician, struggled with this problem for his whole life. And the consensus in contemporary community of logicians and mathematicians is that no, we cannot really prove that. In fact, there's a famous theorem, which kind of sounds bizarre. You can look this up in your own spare time. This has nothing to do with this course, outside of this course, if you're interested. If you're interested in philosophy of mathematics, it's a very famous German and very important German mathematician and logician whose name is Kurt Gödel. And he has proven, to some extent, his Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which says that any logical system that is rich enough to encompass arithmetic must have axioms that are not provable within the system. Must have axioms which are not provable within the system. Which means that you can only prove that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4 if you assume something. Assume, do not, and not prove. Assume and not prove. And how do you know whether your assumptions are true or not? This is the basic problem of the right-hand side of the board. It would be nice if we could derive everything from math, but it seems that we do not have the firm logical foundations of mathematics. I mean, this is Plato's dream. This is Plotinus' dream. This is Leibniz's dream, and to some extent, this is the dream of some mathematicians today. In 1900, again, very important mathematician David Hilbert, in 1900, proposed in a conference in Paris 10 most important problems in mathematics. One of them was to derive physics from math. So mathematicians still want to do this, still hope to do this. But unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, nobody has been able to do that so far. But that's an ongoing debate. And again, if you're interested in this, it's a slightly more abstract, more theoretical problem. But if you're interested in this, course in philosophy of science is for you next year. Okay. Is this more or less clear? Now, what do you need to know from Locke? See, Locke is a very frustrating thinker. He's very influential as a philosopher, but Russell says, and although I'm not supposed to give you my opinion, I will have to agree with Russell, that most of the time, Locke is not a very consistent philosopher. He has some important insights, but by and large, he does not really develop those insights to their logical conclusion, neither in his political philosophy nor in his epistemology, theory of knowledge. So, in some sense, I don't really want to go deep into Locke, because I think that, I agree with Russell, I think that most of the things that Locke puts forward at the end of the day are false. Trying to explain, understand, and memorize falsehood for the exam is not very helpful. So I want to get to Hume, because I think Hume is consistent. So what is it that Hume takes from Locke? Well, what Hume takes from Locke is the understanding that all knowledge comes from experience. All knowledge comes from experience. And Hume says, Locke says that when human beings are born, they are born as blank slates, blank sheets of paper. The Latin word for this is tabula rasa. So, clean board, clean slate. And then all knowledge we have is knowledge that comes from experience, one way or another. And the ultimate, again, judge and justification of all of our propositions has to be grounded in experience. This is about as much as we need to know from Locke. Now, Locke tries to work within the Cartesian framework, within the framework of René Descartes, and talks about minds and bodies, talks about causation, talks about substances. Trouble is that every time he talks about these things, it's not clear when he separates the minds and bodies. What kind of experience is he pointing to in doing that? Complicated, not clear. So the next step in the chain, Bishop Berkeley attacks precisely this point in Locke's argument. So again, go back a step. So we say there are minds and there are bodies. How do I know that I have a mind? Well, for Locke, it's very simple. Everything we know from perception. I directly perceive my own mind. I see my own mind directly. I know it's there. Again, think back to Descartes' cogito ergo sum. I know that I am thinking and I cannot be mistaken about that. So the presence of minds is very clear. Now, what are material objects? Well, this would be some kind of substance or substrate on the other side of my experience. So let's take a very complete example. I'm looking at this marker. What do I know? What do I know? For Locke, strictly speaking, I know only that I have this impression right now. Again, something mental. I have an impression of blueness. I have an impression of a certain shape. I have an impression, a certain tactile impression. I can smell the marker. But all of these things, this is like 5 or 6 different impressions, which in my mind relate to one and the same thing. But so far, the only thing that I can see are the impressions in my own mind. Again, the smell that I perceive is the idea in my mind. The blueness is the idea in my mind. Do I see the marker itself? Again, think about this for 5 seconds. Go back to Descartes' point. Let's suppose you are asleep and you're just imagining the marker. What is the difference between your imagination of the marker and when you open your eyes you're seeing the marker? Well, in principle, the empiricists would say there is no interesting difference. And we've all had this experience while you are asleep. Most of the time it's very hard to tell that you are asleep. And you will worry and expend effort and maybe wake up in the morning and like you're sitting there and you're taking an exam while you're asleep. And the dream that I have from time to time is that I sit down, I read the exam assignment, and suddenly the examiner says, 5 minutes are left. And then I wake up and thank God it was just a dream. But you see, while I was asleep, the dream seemed to be real. So the question is, and in a dream, there is no real marker. There's just an impression of the marker in my own head. And Descartes, and Locke, and Berkeley, and Hume are going to say, well, that's basically the only thing I really have access to. I do not have the access to the marker as a material thing in itself. The only thing I have access to is the impression of the marker in my head. The impression of its shape, its color, its firmness, right? But these things are real to the extent that they exist as mental phenomena in my head. But still, Locke tries to say that, of course, I'm not just imagining all this. There is a real marker. How can he say that? How does he know that? He proposes some arguments, but Russell and I think that these are bad arguments. I'm not even going to tell you what the arguments are. So Berkeley, the thing that Berkeley does is he says Berkeley is the first very self-consciously and very clearly idealistic philosopher in the European tradition. So Berkeley, some form of empirical idealism. Now, certainly there were philosophers who, by some standard, were idealists before Berkeley, but in the present use of the term, Berkeley is the first one. He says the only thing that exists in the whole entire world are ideas. Now, can he actually prove that matter does not exist? Not really. So I would say that Berkeley is also being somewhat inconsistent. Because the fact that I cannot really know for sure that there's a real material marker doesn't mean that the real material marker does not exist. So Berkeley, really overstretches his conclusions. But Berkeley creates this very bizarre but very interesting system in which the only thing that exists is this God's mind, in which there are us. This infinite mind of God, there's a finite mind of us. And basically, the reason why you look at this marker and I look at this marker, we see the same thing, is because God synchronizes our experience. This should remind you of Leibniz and his monads, and his pre-established harmony between the monads. It's very similar. And basically, Berkeley says that the reason why this marker falls at the follows the inverse square law of Galileo, S equals 1/2 gt squared, right? So I let go of the marker, and it falls according to this equation. Well, what Berkeley is going to say, the reason why this equation is true is not because there's real physical force and real physical objects out there in the world. No, this does not exist. All these things exist only as ideas in God's mind. And this is a grammatical rule of God's language. It's grammar of God's mind. It's not a real, real is the wrong word. It's not a material causal principle. It is a principle of grammar. The principle of relation between ideas in God's mind. Now this is where we stand when we finally get to David Hume. Let me pause here for 1 second and ask you if you have any questions up until this point. Questions? Problems? More or less clear? Yeah. We'll go over some of these questions in the seminar again. Okay, so finally we get to Hume. And Russell praises Hume very highly as the most consistent empirical philosopher. And I think that's very well deserved. Hume leads empiricism to its logical conclusion. So again, the basic premise of Hume's argument is that all of our knowledge comes from experience. Again, and I think this is not everybody agrees, obviously, but I think this is a deeply intuitive point. Like, when you do a mathematical problem, can you be sure that your solution is correct? Has this ever happened to you when you were solving a mathematical equation and you thought your answer was right and then it turned out to be wrong? Does this happen to you? Yeah, it happens to you. It happens to you every day. So, see, the certainty of our own mind in logical or mathematical derivations seems to be very, shaky, very precarious. So why should we trust that? Like, if I really create some, crazy equation, like I calculate the roots of the Riemann zeta function for negative integers, how do I know whether my calculation makes sense or not? Or let's say I postulate that I is the square root of -1. How do I know that that's a valid postulation? And it seems that even for contemporary mathematics, the answer is, can you do physics with it? And you can do physics with negative -1, and you amazingly actually can do physics with the negative roots of the Riemann zeta function. Really amazing, but again, physical experiments show us the validity. So even though not everybody agrees with Hume, I think in a certain sense this is a very intuitively clear position. It's a very basic position that all of our knowledge comes from experience. However, the question then arises: what can we really know if the only real valid source of knowledge is our experience for Hume? And Hume's answer is not very much. Not very much. And in trying to untangle this, Hume sets the basis for basically all of contemporary philosophy of science. So if you want to understand the basic premise of contemporary philosophy of science, and in some sense, contemporary science in general, like physics, cosmology, statistics, you need to understand what Hume is talking about. So Hume begins by saying that we have impressions. We have impressions. So I'm looking at the marker, I have the impression of the marker. And then in addition to impressions, I have ideas. But what are ideas? Ideas are, as he says, decayed impressions. Decayed impressions, so memories of impressions. So simple illustration, I clap my hands, you hear a sound. Now, close your eyes and remember the sound. You remember the sound, right? So the clapping is the impression, the memory is the idea. And Hume wants to say that in the mind, all of your mental life can be divided into impressions and ideas. So basically, if you're talking about the Riemann zeta function, Hume would say Riemann zeta function is a very complex combination of ultimately of decayed impressions. You had some kind of impression early in life, and then this impression decayed and combined with other ideas, with other decayed impressions, and over time you create this complex. And again, I mean, how do you do this? Like Hume says, you see a bird and you see a horse. You have two decayed impressions. One decayed impression, so an idea of a bird, another idea of a horse. You combine them in your head and you get a Pegasus, a winged horse. So in the same fashion, when you're a child, you get an idea of maybe one, or an idea of two, then you get a bunch more ideas, you combine them as birds and horses to form ideas of Pegasus, and you combine them to form the idea of Riemann zeta function. Slightly more complicated, but the general process is the same. And Hume, again, it's a very strong point. The difference between an idea and an impression is only, as he says, vivacity or force. So if you were very good at imagination, you could close your eyes and your impression would be indistinguishable from what you see in the real world. And of course, again, dreaming, hallucination, psychedelic drugs, this sometimes does happen to people when impressions in their head are indistinguishable from reality. Mm-hmm. So, the next step from question.
Okay, so ideas and decayed impression. What does decay do? Decay place.
Decay.
A decay.
Decay. Like, well, one synonym is rot. but lose force, lose bleakness. Yeah, more faded. Some of that, yeah. Thank you. But that was a good question. By the way, if something I say is unclear, by all means, or some word I'm using, by all means, do stop. Any other questions at this stage?
Does it mean that complex ideas belong to imagination?
Yeah. See, this is very important. The role of imagination in perception. The role of imagination in perception. In some sense, this is the basic insight of both Hume and Kant. That perception, to a large extent, is actually imagination. And see, this is a philosophy class, so it's kind of illegal to appeal to science. But if you look at contemporary psychology and contemporary neurophysiology, this is basically validated by the consensus among the scientists today. That yes, your perception is to a large extent imagination. So you're actually looking at this room. If we track the movement of your eye, so again, part of the things you actually see, but part of the things you just imagine in your head. You're not actually seeing them. We'll get to some example this time and next time. Not necessarily. Two people can look at the same object and see something different. The beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Again, the simplest explanation is taste. Like one person looks at a painting and sees a beautiful painting, another person sees an ugly painting. It's a difference in your imagination, if you want. But other conceptions as well. Again, this is going to be important. I'm not supposed to talk about this right now, but this is so important. Let me finish this thought. That for both Hume and Kant, the mind isn't just a passive recipient of information from the outside world. The mind actively constructs our experience through something like imagination. Very simple example. I see this differently from most of you. Not because the lines on the board are different, but because our mind actively does different things with this. Yes, because I, to some extent, know this language.
What is imagination for Hume?
What is imagination for Hume? We'll get there. In a second. Let me read this one. Distract me. So go back a step. So all of our knowledge is knowledge, and Hume agrees, of matters of fact or relations of ideas. Now, matters of fact bottom out in impressions about the world. Relations of ideas, again, remember, ideas are also derived from experience. So you take this idea, you take that idea, formed as decayed impressions, and you relate them to one another. Now, the problem for Hume, and actually for contemporary philosophy of science in general, is that relations of ideas does not really give you new knowledge. The knowledge about relations of ideas, this side of the board, is tautological. The conclusion is already contained in the premise. Okay, all triangles have three sides, or all bachelors are unmarried. Bachelor, English word for холостяк, obviously, right? One meaning for the word. But this is not new knowledge. You cannot really generate new knowledge just by relations of ideas, it seems. So, knowledge of relations of ideas seems to be certain, but fruitless, useless, doesn't really get you anywhere. Just deals in empty tautologies. And even if Hume actually tackles this example, he says geometry is not, unlike for Leibniz, for Hume geometry isn't just about the notion of relations of ideas. You also need to observe the outside world, because he says, how do you know the axioms of geometry? You don't generate them by your own mind, says Hume. You actually see them from the real world. And geometry is not a futile and useless subject, but not because relations of ideas give you truth, but because its geometry is true to the extent that it's rooted in matters of fact. Okay. But let's look at the matters of fact. So again, relations of ideas are true but useless. But what knowledge can you derive from matters of fact? Well, basically, Hume says, following Descartes, that the only thing I can really know as a matter of fact is something like cogito ergo sum. I can know for certain what happens to me right now. So it is certainly true that it seems to me that I see a marker. It is certainly true that it seems to me that I'm awake. It's certainly true that it seems to me that I'm giving this lecture. But is this true that there is a marker? Is it true that I actually am giving a lecture? I don't know. Is it true that I woke up this morning? I don't know. I have a memory that I woke up this morning. But is it true? Did this really happen? I don't know. I'm not sure. And this is big problem. Big problem. Okay. So one of the key issues that Hume wants to address is the issue of causality. Causality. Causality in Russian. Причинность. A causes B. Why is this important? Again, we are talking about the new sciences. We are talking about the laws of motion. Galileo's law, S equals 1/2 gt squared. Or Newton's F equals ma. Or Newton's, the force of gravity equals to the mass 1 multiplied by mass 2 divided by r squared multiplied by g, right? This is the new science. This is the new science. And Hume looks at these equations and he asks, is it true? Maybe. Is it true by virtue of matters of fact or relations of ideas? Let's start with relations of ideas. Obviously not true by virtue of relations of ideas. Again, F equals ma is not the same thing as triangle has 3 sides. You cannot just look at this equation and say, yes, it's true. Unfortunately. Although again, think, I want you to feel the force of the argument. Any of you interested in philosophy of mathematics? Some of you in the 3rd year will take advanced math. Talk about this with your teacher. David Hilbert, again in 1900, wanted to mathematically derive physics. To show, David Hilbert wants to show that these equations are necessary. Again, David Hilbert, probably the greatest mathematician of the 20th century. He has some competition, but certainly one of the greatest. If you ever become interested in math seriously, right? So not true by virtue of relations of ideas, or at least we cannot show that it's true. And if we cannot show right now that it's true, then we can't really assume that. Leibniz assumes that at some point we shall be able to prove this analytically. Nobody has seen the proof. So Hume is skeptical, and Hume has every right to be skeptical until he sees the proof. Now, is this true by virtue of matters of fact? Is this true by virtue of matters of fact? Now, this is the crucial question. This is the crucial question. So what happens is that I take a graph and I plot. Let's say g is a constant, so I plot s, which is distance, and on the other one t. And what do I do? I make an experiment and I do observations, right? And I get these points. And now what I want to do is I want to generalize these points into the graph, into a formula, into this formula. This is a familiar problem from statistics. You do regressions, right? Question. Can you be sure of what equation underlies the observations? Can you unequivocally decide what is the right equation? If I give you a set of points, how many functions, different functions, can you draw through these points? I give you an arbitrary set of points, arbitrary, any points, and there's always an infinite set of functions that goes through them. Problem. Big problem. So how do you know that s is equal to 1/2 gt squared is the right equation? Well, physicists usually go with the simplest equation. But how do they know that the simplest equation is the right equation.
How was it?
Well, s equals 1/2 c squared, you can show, again, by doing an experiment like this. And you plot the graph, and it seems that it's going to... Now, obviously, this is before Einstein, so this equation is not true. You have to add corrections for general and special relativity. I don't want to talk... So actually, amazingly, these formulas, and this is, you see, this is why physicists talk about this today. If you want to be a physicist, you have to think through David Hume. Because for like 200 years, people thought that these equations are true with a capital T. And then comes Einstein and shows that they're not exactly true. That you have to add corrections for relativity. And if they're not exactly true, how do you know? Maybe at some point in the future they will become completely false. How do you know? And actually, again, when faced with this problem, I mean, we're talking about this when we talk about Hume, but this is also a problem for Locke. And Locke exposes this problem. And Isaac Newton read John Locke, and Isaac Newton has changed the preface to his most famous work, the Principia Mathematica, which is here's basically the outline of Newton's physics. And in the preface, in response to this problem, in response to John Locke, Isaac Newton, the most famous physicist of all time, apart from maybe Einstein, he wrote that I do not explain, says Newton. I don't know. I don't have the slightest idea of why these formulas are true. I cannot tell you why they are true. The only thing I can show you is that, look, I've done the observations and I've looked through my telescope, and these equations seem to fit the data. Again, this is the empiricist approach. These are the observations that do not explain, but describe my past experience. It's like a summary of my past experience. Summary of my experience from the past. The way it seems to me I have remembered it. For that's not much. Is this really knowledge? Does this count as genuine true knowledge? Not exactly clear. Okay. So, let me go back to my annoying example. So, on the board, we are talking about complicated processes. Force of gravity. So, I let the marker go and it falls because of the force of gravity. Let's take something simpler. I flip the switch. And the lights come on and come off. Right? Question. Did my action cause the light to flicker? Again, remember, we are empiricists. We can only assert what we see from experience. What have you seen? Well, according to Hume, the only thing that you have seen is event A, flipping of the switch, followed by event B, light coming on and coming off. Can you tell, just by looking at the experience, can you tell whether I have caused the light to come on and come off? Or maybe, imagine this switch is actually broken, and there's my friend on the other side of this door, who hears me click and turns the real switch on the other side of the door.
We see the tire and the impulse. The tire.
So you can take this apart, and you can look at the wires, and you can see the impulse. Trouble is that the same problem will repeat. Because, okay, you say, it wasn't the flipping of the switch that caused the light, but the flow of electricity. But how does the flow of electricity turn on the light? And at some point, you're going to have to give some complicated answer about electrons and, free electrons moving through lattice structures in the ion channels of metal, something like that. But at the end of the day, you're going to see one event A followed by another event B. Something like that. Let's say this electron moves, and this electron moves after it. Even at the basic physics, in physics, we have four fundamental forces, which are what? Somebody should tell me. The four fundamental equations of the universe. Gravity, electromagnetism, weak nuclear force and strong nuclear force. 4 forces. When you look at those equations, see, we the scientists, right now, we cannot go deeper than those equations. We just see them as regularities. One event followed by another event. We cannot explain them. Now, maybe someday, string theory turns out to be true. We can go slightly deeper, but still, you're going to get another equation which seems to be just a full fact, just a regularity. So basically, what Hume is saying, the upshot of what Hume is saying is that we are never entitled to talk about causation. Why? Because we never observe causation. We can never observe causation. We can never have an experience of causation. The only experience that we have is the experience as, and this is, you should write this down, constant conjunction of resembling instances. Constant conjunction of resembling instances. No causation, but constant conjunction of resembling instances. So, what does it mean, constant conjunction of resembling instances? One thing followed by another thing. Repetition. Not причина следствия, but регулярность, повторение. Yeah, correlation, not causation. Correlation, not causation.
You talked about 4 main reasons.
Forces, yeah.
How do we know that they're right? Like, how can we
Assume that they are.
This is a very good question. This is an excellent question. I give you 2 answers. One answer is talk to me after class, because I don't want to go into this right now. This will take, of course. Another answer I can give is take my course next year, because we'll talk about that. Anyway, let's go back to Hume. So, again, we do not experience, says Hume, the power, or the have to, or the will. We do not right now experience the future. That is why we cannot assert that we experience causation. We know what causation is. The only thing we see is regularity. Correlation, not causation. And this is basically the position of contemporary physics. Contemporary physicists agree with this notion, which is exactly why in your statistics textbooks, you never accept hypotheses. You always say, I have failed to reject at this confidence level. Science, ever since Hume, serious science, does not deal in truth. Science deals in probable hypotheses. Probable meaning describing experience, past experience, to a higher or lower degree of accuracy. This is the only thing that science can actually do after Hume. Now, questions about this problem. Okay, let me make a remark and then make an important general point. A remark. You never experience causation. You want to raise your arm, you intend, like you try to make your arm move, and your arm goes up. Has your mind caused your arm to go up? You see a regularity, I want it, and it went up. But is it actually true? Did your mind actually cause it to go up? And the answer is, you don't know. Which is why, for Descartes, you remember? Well, not for Descartes, but strictly speaking for Malebranche and Goelings, the theory of 2 clocks. You remember this? My mind actually does not cause my arm to go up. It just seems to me that way. Likewise, for Leibniz, pre-established harmony, my mind actually doesn't make my arm go up. It's a pre-established harmony, but it's an illusion. The only thing I see is regularity. It's not causation. And actually, if you believe contemporary neurobiologists, of course you don't see the whole causal chain that makes your arm go up. And to some extent, this opens a huge door for people like Nietzsche and Freud to talk about the unconscious and how human beings actually do not really understand what their behavior is like. And based on certain regularities, human beings conclude things about themselves, like we have a theory about ourselves, but this theory, to a large extent, is just false, because we don't really understand the functioning of our body and of our psyche. And Hume opens the door to that. So Hume, which is one of the reasons Hume is one of my favorite philosophers of all time, Hume is a very important precursor to Nietzsche. And Russell writes about that. Okay. More general point. This picture is terribly disconcerting. terribly disorienting. It's very uncomfortable. Why? Because it seems that all of our knowledge is really very shaky, very unstable. It's only based on these extrapolations from the past. But you could say, look, it's not too bad. We don't know that the equations are true, but at least these are the best possible equations we could come up with. And Hume says, here, you're all very wrong. Why? Because if you want to use these equations into the future, you cannot just look at the past. You also need to add another crucial assumption, so crucial that I'm going to write it in red. And the crucial assumption, again, assumption which you cannot prove, is that future will resemble the past. Future will resemble the past. Now, to some extent, this is the most troubling issue in all of Hume. And let's talk about this. Let's talk about this in detail. Again, when you wake up in the morning and boil your kettle to make yourself some coffee, you assume that the future will resemble the past. When you descend into the metro, when you go to the university, when you sit the exam, you constantly assume every waking moment of your life that the future will resemble the past. But Hume asks, how do you know? Obviously, you don't know this by virtue of relations of ideas, but can you know this by virtue of matters of fact? And one attempt would be to say, one immediate attempt would be to say, well, it's actually fine. It's fine to think that the future will resemble the past. Why? Because we know that in the past, future has resembled the past. So, pasts have resembled past futures. So it's okay. It's okay. So if pasts have resembled past futures, then it's okay to think that futures will resemble past. Hume says, no, because this is something that happened in the past, and if you want to extrapolate this into the future, you need to assume that future will resemble the past. Only if future will resemble the past, then the fact that future has resembled the past in the past will be relevant. Do you understand this point?
Can you explain?
Okay. So I'm basically like last Tuesday has resembled last Friday. How do I know that a future Tuesday will resemble a future Friday? So this is not a very good way to phrase it. Again, we are trying to prove, how do you know that the laws of nature will remain the same in the next moment? By the way, again. If you go back to somebody like Newton thought that laws were unchanging, but that's not true. We know, because of Einstein, that certain things could happen to Earth that would change the way matter behaves, that would change the way gravity behaves. How do you know that, let's say, it's a science fiction scenario, let's say our galaxy will collide with another galaxy in the fourth dimension in the next 5 seconds, and we will all die, we ripped to shreds. Is this possible? Well, it's possible in the sense of it's thinkable. Let's say within string theory, that's a thinkable possibility. I'm not saying it's going to happen, it's a thinkable possibility. How do you know that's not going to happen? And let's say all the laws, because the two galaxies collide in the fourth dimension, two universes collide in the fourth dimension, all the laws will change in the next moment. How do you know that? Yeah, but how can you know the probability? You are trying to extrapolate. You understand the word extrapolate from statistics?
No.
Extrapoляция? No?
When the Russian, no.
Extrapolation. So extrapolation basically means you take a certain sample and you conclude from the sample, let's say, into the future or into the past. That's extrapolation. Like filling in the blanks.
The same thing, you think that it must work like that because it is the most probable thing.
Yeah, but you see, probability works. Probability works. You can have probable conclusions only if you assume that future will resemble the past. Because the future won't resemble the past, and all of your past probabilities tell you nothing, absolutely nothing. Okay, let me rephrase this as a different example. Hopefully you know enough about statistics to understand this example. So let's imagine, it's a thought experiment. You have like a black door, or black window, and you reach into this black window, and you take out an object. And then another object appears, and another object appears. And let's suppose that the three objects are three black pebbles. How do you know that the fourth object will be another black pebble? Now, this is a thought experiment. You don't know the size of the room. You don't know how objects get selected. Is there a child on the other side of the room? Is it random shuffling? Or is this an evil demon who's trying to pick you? Right? So you have your observations, and you know nothing about the population size. Again, from statistics. So you basically, let's say, you assume that the population size, since you don't know it, could be infinite. Let's suppose it's infinite. So you take your n, and you divide it by infinity. This is your wonderful probability.
Why do we study statistics?
Hume will give an answer to this question in a second. Before we try to answer this, let's understand that, again, even though we talk about probabilities, no, you can't talk about probabilities. But when you say that the probability of rain today is going to be this or that, this is only true if you add an unproven assumption. If you want an article of religious faith that the future will resemble the past, but you cannot prove it. So it's fine as long as you introduce unprovable axioms. Same as with Kurt Gödel. It's fine to believe that 2 + 2 = 4 if you're willing to introduce unproven axioms. This is risky, because you don't know whether the axioms are true or false, but you can't do it this way. How does Hume solve this? Well, on some level, he doesn't solve this. He takes it and he runs with it. Says this is what every sane person has to understand. Yes, you believe these things, you have your reasons, but your reasons rest on nothing at the end of the day. But what shall we do? What shall we do with it? Well, first of all, let me, in one sentence, tell you about what is me. Right? What shall I do with it? But what am I? What is I? Am I an immortal soul? Like in Descartes or Spinoza or Leibniz? And Hume would say, well, is the fact that I'm an immortal soul, is that a matter of fact or relations of ideas? And Hume says, well, really neither. So what are you? What are you? And Hume says, in an important respect, there's no such thing as you. There is, what Hume says, it's a bundle of impressions, like a bucket of impressions. So I close my eyes, I clench my forehead, and I try to look into myself. What do I see? Well, maybe I see a slight hangover from a little bit too much last night. Or I see a desire to drink a glass of water. Or I see the impressions of you guys. But do I see, among all of these impressions, in this flow of consciousness, do I see myself? And Hume, again anticipating Freud and anticipating Nietzsche, says no. It's only this ever-changing bundle of impressions. Ask yourself this question: how do you know that you are the same person from moment to moment? I mean, right now you have memories of your past and anticipation of the future, but both the memory and the anticipation exist in the now. Imagine you're in the Matrix. Have you seen the movie The Matrix? And a mad scientist simulates your memories. I mean, we know, as far as we can trust science, we know that we can physically, surgically mess with your memories. We can do certain, I could do certain things to your head to make some of your memories disappear, for example, right now. Hopefully I won't, because I'll go to prison then, but probably. What is probability? Assuming that the future will resemble the past, right? But how you justify in saying that you are the same thing over time. Now, Hume was not entirely satisfied with this, and as you will learn from McGee and Passmore. By the way, the home assignments, the chapter from Russell and the chapter from McGee are both wonderful readings, and I highly advise you read them carefully. Anyway, but Hume was not entirely satisfied with this because he couldn't really construct a philosophy without the word I. Like, who is confused about his own existence, his or her own existence? Hume runs into some linguistic problems. But the basic upshot is clear. The same way that I do not experience causation, I also do not experience my unchanging soul. So actually, at the end of the day, for Hume, it's not clear if I am the same person I was, let's say, 10 years ago. Yeah, there's a similarity, but is it the same person? Or could it be that the universe is destroyed and recreated every second? Does this remind you of anything? This could remind you of certain precepts, the skepticism, in the general skepticism, the skepticism about causation and skepticism about the self, could remind you of some of the precepts of Buddha. And actually, it is theoretically possible that Hume got these ideas from the Buddhists, because they were at this time beginning to be translated into English. We don't have any solid proof of that. No solid proof exists. But it is at least plausible, and the ideas do sound similar in many respects. Let me just leave it out there. Anyway, so what do you do with this? Like, if you think about this very carefully, I think that the natural human reaction is horror. When I was your age, first of all, Hume was my favorite philosopher of all the studied literature. And secondly, when I thought about this carefully, I had this experience of completely losing the ground beneath my feet. Like, total vertigo. Like, your head begins to spin. And you look at the walls, and you can't even trust the walls in a room when you think about this very carefully. And I think that if you want to be a philosopher, if you want to do philosophy seriously, you have to have this experience at some point. Now, this experience, I think, is captured by Hume, but even better, wonderfully captured by Jean-Paul Sartre in his novel, The Nausea. Has any of you read that? Sartre's Nausea. No. Тошнота Sartre. Some of you will maybe read it at some point. It's a wonderful description of a person's world basically falling to pieces when he thinks, the main character thinks of something like this. So, but what is the answer? Let me read you from Hume, from this wonderful book. Where am I? Or what am I? From what causes do I derive from my existence? To what conditions shall I return? I am confused with all these questions, and begin to imagine myself in the most horrible condition imaginable, surrounded by deepest darkness, and utterly deprived of any use of member or faculty, says Hume. So if this upsets you, it should upset you. It has upset David Hume. What is the solution? He says, most fortunately, it happens that since reason is incapable of dispelling this cloud, since I cannot reason myself out of skepticism, nature herself suffices to that purpose and cures me of this philosophical melancholy and delirium, either by relaxing the spent of mind or by some evocation and lively impression of my senses, which obliterate all these chimeras. I dine, I play a game of backgammon, I converse, I'm merry with my friends. And when, after 3 or 4 hours' amusement, I return to these speculations, they appear so cold and strange and ridiculous that I cannot find it in my heart to enter into them any farther. And the conclusion is this: nature is always too strong for principle. Nature is too strong for principle. What has Hume said? Say basically that if I were a perfectly rational creature, this would drive me to despair. But I, again anticipating Nietzsche and Freud, I am not a rational creature. How do I know that I'm not a rational creature? Do I a constant conjunction of do I know this for certain? No. As a matter of fact, I see in the past, basically, and in the present, that I do not completely control my psychology. There are things that happen to me, like thoughts pop into my mind, desires pop into my psychology. I do not control this. So there's a huge chunk of my psychology which is not controllable by me. And I can think as much as I want about all this skeptical stuff, but in the morning I get thirsty and I get hungry. And this is a pain or a desire that is not really controllable. He says nature is too strong for principle, basically saying that passions are stronger than reason. In human beings, passions are stronger than reason. And we believe, the statisticians, and we believe the physicists, not because we have a rational ground to believe in them, but because we are irrational. And it's too painful for us, basically, to think about these things too hard. This is his solution. Says the only reason I think that water satisfies thirst and fire gives me warmth is because it is too painful for me to think otherwise. And also, in a wonderful phrase, a little bit of a biographical speculation. This is the actual book I had when I was your age, sitting in classroom almost like this, and Krista was giving almost this lecture, right? It happened slightly more years ago than I care to admit. So on page 672, so I was your age reading this exact book, this was my book, which I ordered from Amazon in my first year. He says that the reason for studying philosophy on page 672 for Hume is that it's an agreeable way of passing time. Agreeable way of passing time. He says, I feel I should be a loser in a point of pleasure, and this is the origin of my philosophy. The only justification for doing philosophy, says Hume, is because it's fun. These are the words that I read when I was your age, a student, right? And decided that maybe, this is the kind of fun I want to do for a living. And here I am, standing in front of you. So this is a very special lecture for me in a lot of important respects. But, so this is a biographical point, but this is on Hume's part, and this is an important anthropological point. If you want to understand human beings, not know truth about human beings, but create plausible stories about human beings based on past regularities, we need to assume that human beings are irrational. And again, in some sense, in the first semester, we had this notion that the sophists and the skeptics are the bad guys. In the second semester, according to somebody like Bertrand Russell, no, the sophists and the skeptics are the good guys. They are the winners of the philosophical debates. At the end of the day, Hume says there's no such thing as knowledge, there's only conviction, there's only persuasion. I can never prove anything to you, I can only rhetorically persuade. And even the 2 + 2 = 4, that's just persuasion. Going back to the ancient sophists, Protagoras and Thrasymachus, and Callicles and all the rest of them. Anyway, so this for Hume creates a very interesting picture of human morality and of human political philosophy. Because he says that we observe, as a matter of fact, that everybody wants to have pleasure and to avoid pain. Again, in this empirical sense. And Hume says that really, moral philosophy cannot really validly talk about anything outside of this. So the only valid topic for moral philosophy is how to make life more pleasant. And same goes for political philosophy. The only real goal of political association or of political philosophy is how to make our life together more pleasant. And there's nothing in addition to that. There's no higher meaning of human life in addition to that. Hume, by the way, also is the first great philosopher in this book was a complete and thorough atheist. With possible exception of several Greek philosophers, it's hard to say. Not much survives from them. Hobbes is probably also an atheist, but Hobbes, in his time, would have gotten into a lot of trouble if he actually publicly said that. So, and Hume is actually the first openly atheistic philosopher who actually, among other things, attacks the arguments for the existence of God. Argument from causation? Laughable, says Hume. Argument from design? Interesting thing he says, an imperfectly ordered world can only establish an imperfectly powerful designer. So an imperfect world can only show an existence of an imperfect God, but an imperfect God is a contradiction in terms. I don't want to go there. What about the ontological argument? Well, the ontological argument is precisely trying to put relations of ideas back into matters of fact. And Hume says that's illegal, that's invalid. Experience has to prove ideas, not the other way around. We'll talk about the ontological argument more next time, because Kant basically demolishes the ontological argument on Humean grounds. We'll have a chance to return to that next time. Kant, by the way, even though I think that at the end of the day Kant cannot really respond to Hume, Kant actually imports a lot of his philosophy from Hume. So if you understand Hume, you understand half of Kant's philosophy. Okay, there's a lot more to say. Unfortunately, not all the time. Questions, problems, comments? I hope that this was stimulating and maybe a little bit fun. If you have any questions, feel free to talk to me now or in the seminars. Otherwise, thank you very much for your attention. Again, I hope this was fun. And I will see you, some of you today and some of you on Tuesday. Thank you.